Hi Dragonflies, welcome back to Dragonfly Spirit Studio. I'm Lynn Bauer. In the last video, I shared a couple of ideas for situations where you don't want to see pencil marks in your finished watercolor, but you still need some sort of roadmap for where to place things on the page. We're going to see a couple of those ideas in action in this postcard paint along. So if you missed that video and you want to catch up, I'll put a link down in the video description. And in this video, I'm also going to share a little bit of the planning process. So this is a postcard paint along and plan along. So instead of just giving some instructions for here's how to paint a little postcard like this, I want to talk about a situation that's pretty common when we decide that we're going to do more sketching on location. You come across a subject like this that looks very appealing, but it's kind of complicated and it's hard to figure out how to turn it into a nice painting or a nice sketch quickly. And so you pull out your phone or your camera and take a quick picture and move on to the next thing. And the next, and the next, and the next. And you wind up coming home with lots of photos that are of interesting subjects, but the photos themselves aren't particularly well composed, and they don't necessarily translate into a painting directly. And this is what went in your sketchbook. And that's fine if you intended to spend some time just snapping some quick photos, but often this happens when you actually intended to spend some time sketching, and anxiety drove you to take photos instead, or spend most of your time taking photos, because you worried that you couldn't capture enough information or accurate enough information to come back and use those sketches as the basis for a painting. If you have no interest in sketching in the field or the planning process and you just want to get to the paint along, you can jump to this timestamp here. But if you do want to eventually learn to plan your own watercolors and feel more confident sketching in the field, planning a postcard based on your field sketches is a great place to develop some confidence that you don't have to capture every piece of information. And if you just start the editing process a little earlier, the situation can become a lot less overwhelming. Now, I'll just admit at the outset that I am as bad as anyone I know at just jumping in and starting a sketch without taking any time for planning or forethought. When I'm working in a travel sketchbook where I want the sketchbook to actually be a memento of the trip, I try to slow myself down and do a little more planning and think about what might make a manageable subject for the time available. But when I'm doing this kind of sketching, I like to work in the margins of my studio notebook, where I don't have room to make a complete sketch, so that takes away the anxiety about whether I can finish a complete sketch. So what I'm doing here is letting myself explore some ideas for ways that I might suggest the petals in these flowers. And at the same time, I'm paying attention to how I feel about what's going on, both how it looks and how it feels to do. And as I'm working here, I'm realizing there is no way that I have the patience to make this whole field of flowers using this method, at least not for a postcard. And besides, I'm usually not just making one postcard. I want to mail a postcard to several friends. So I don't want each postcard to take a long time. And that's an awful lot of information to cram onto a postcard anyway. I used to beat myself up a bit about my bad habit of jumping in and starting a sketch without any planning. But eventually I realized that it's actually not necessarily a bad habit. It can actually serve me very well. With a complicated subject like this, or really any subject if I'm feeling a little stressed or rushed, I have a tendency to simply mentally draw a box around the subject that interests me, or maybe even take a photo so I have a box around the subject. And then jump immediately to the question of how am I going to accurately represent everything that's inside that mental box, and jump right over questions about what is it that I most want to capture about this scene and What can I capture with the time and materials I have available? I can wind up planning a sketch that might have a good design and color scheme, but isn't even something I want to do, or perhaps doesn't capture what I most wanted to capture. Allowing myself to go ahead and think on paper this way lets me discover things like, I really don't want to paint every little flower in that rectangle. So this sort of playing around in the margins gives me an opportunity both to explore some techniques I might want to use and to explore my feelings for the subject a little more before I jump in and actually start trying to make a sketch or make a painting. Now, you might feel like I've just wasted a bunch of time that I could have spent making a postcard painting all those little flowers in that scene. But for me, taking 3 or 4 or 10 minutes doing this sort of exploration first means I'm much more likely to paint a postcard that I enjoy making and am satisfied with. And if this is a travel sketchbook, I often find a page like this where I've tried maybe several different ways to suggest a subject that's new to me or a bit complicated is just as appealing or maybe more appealing than a complete sketch of a scene. Once I've done a bit of sketching, I also realized that I actually don't need a whole lot of information about how these sunflowers look to make a quick and satisfying postcard. Since I already know that my little brush drawing appealed to me, and I have bigger brushes, so I can adapt that to a bigger flower for a postcard, I don't feel a huge burden to draw it exactly right as I'm making this sketch. That means that the decision to continue to sketch or add more details is based on enjoyment and curiosity instead of worries that my sketch isn't good enough or just because I think I need to make a finished picture. It's the bright yellow color and the shapes that I find most attractive, but I do find it kind of interesting that the petals have those raggedy outer edges and they look sort of pleated. So if I have enough time, I might devote some time to sketching a few petals more carefully, or this might be the time to pull out my camera now that I know what I really need it to capture. But for the purposes of a postcard, I probably captured all the essential information in those little brush drawings and these little diagrams of the flower shapes. And unlike snapping a quick picture, making some sketches actually focuses my attention on what I'm really seeing and what I find most interesting about it. I know that I don't want to paint a whole bunch of sunflowers, but one would feel a little lonely to me on a postcard, so I decided to use 2. These flowers are basically circular, so I'm just going to draw a couple circles, or since I don't want both sunflowers to be directly facing the viewer, I have to draw them as ellipses. So a trick for this, if you find that a bit challenging, is to take a circular object and actually move it around in front of you so you can really see those elliptical shapes. I like to do this phase of the planning in a digital drawing or painting app where I can put each flower in a different layer and play around with moving them and resizing them. But you can also take a more low-tech approach and simply draw your 2 flowers on separate pieces of tracing paper and then lay them on top of a postcard to see how you like the arrangement. Then I take another piece of tracing paper and transfer just the things that I need to indicate where to place my flowers, the centers and those radiating lines for each petal. I've drawn the outer circles here so you can see a little bit where the flowers are, but I'm not going to transfer those circles on the outside of each flower. I'm planning to try using a sponge to make that fluffy center portion of the flower, so I don't want to see a pencil circle around it, so I'm using a gold-colored watercolor pencil, which I hope will dissolve and soften and give me enough of a roadmap for where to place my sponge, but not show up in the finished painting. Then I'm using a pale yellow watercolor pencil to indicate the center of each petal. This gives me some guidelines for the direction and placement of the petals. And since these petals have those little pleats, I'm hoping that if any echo of this still remains, it will blend right into the nature of the petals for this flower. And this should be all I need to place things on the page with confidence. I already know that I want to use individual brush marks to make the petals on my flowers, but before I jump right in and start on my postcard, I'm going to test this idea with different brushes on a scrap piece of paper. This means I can experiment freely with a variety of different brushes and see which one makes the marks that I like best. I can play around with how I want to do the center of my flowers and how I might want to paint around the outside without having to think about anything to do with placement or any other aspect of the painting. As I always say, it's much easier for me to manage if I can just deal with one difficulty at a time. None of the brushes that I tried gave me that raggedy edge, and I decided it wasn't important enough for me to continue to try to find a brush that would do that, because I can suggest those shapes as I add the green for the background to my flowers. So I'm simply working my way around the flower, occasionally dropping in a little bit darker yellow for some variation or to suggest a shadow, but mostly just using those center lines as an indication of the length and direction of each brush mark that I need to make for my petals. If it starts to feel a little awkward, I can turn the page to make the angle a little easier, and I simply go all the way around. This flower is the one that I planned to have in the foreground or on top of the other flower, so I definitely don't have to worry about trying to stop my petals before they run into the petals of the other flower. And you'll see in a moment that we don't have to worry about that for the second flower either. But before I move on to the second flower, I want to add some slightly more golden yellow to the center as the base for the center of my flower. And I'm trying to let it touch some of the petals and bleed softly into some of the other petals, and even smudge it a little bit so that it's not so clearly defined. So I'm taking a sponge that's just barely damp, or you could use a paper towel that's just barely damp, and slightly smudging the edges of that center area. Now we'll paint the second flower using the same technique. And when we get to the part where the petals overlap the first flower, we're going to just ignore that first flower and keep painting. And then we'll come back in another step and add just the suggestion of a shadow to indicate which flower is in front and separate the two. So don't worry at all when you get to the part where the petals would run into the next flower. Just keep on going as though the other flower weren't even there. And as before, I'll add a little bit of that slightly more golden yellow to the center while everything's still wet, so it will bleed a bit, and I'll smudge the edges to suggest that softness of the center of the flower. Letting this slightly darker yellow bleed into the petals helps to start suggesting a little bit of shadowing right around that center area of the flower. One feature I noticed and found interesting when I was doing my pencil sketch is these little orange dots around the outside of the center. Instead of trying to reserve the dots, I'm just going to make the edge of the center of my flower kind of a broken brown edge and let some of that more orangey yellow shine through. So I'm going to mix up a brown, and while this is still pretty wet, I'm going to drop in some brown dots around the edge. It's no longer visible on the video, but I can still see the ghost of that watercolor pencil line we drew to help guide me as to how to create the shape of the center of this flower. And now I'm also going to fill in that little ellipse for the darkest part of the center and make the edge a little raggedy. And I'll come back later after this is dry with a sponge to add a little bit more brown and fill things in. And we'll do the same for the second flower. I actually like these flowers pretty well just as they are, and you could just add a stem to each one and call it done. But let's see if we can add a little suggestion of some of that pleated look that the petals have. What I've done here is added just a tiny bit of green to the yellow that I was using for the petals. And I'm going to add just a few little straight strokes here and there to suggest the shadows where one petal goes under the other, or some of those little pleats. One thing that helps with this is not to necessarily draw them the whole length of the petal everywhere, but occasionally just show part of that. I am trying to imagine where one petal might go behind another as a place to put a little shadow, but I'm not trying to match any particular petal or be too analytical about this. Just a suggestion. Let the viewer's imagination fill in some of the details. These shadows look a little bit more brownish on the video, at least on my video, than they do in real life. So I just want to mention why use a tiny bit of green in the shadows on a yellow flower. That's because these flowers are mostly surrounded by greenish foliage, so the reflected light in the shadows has a slightly greenish cast. We want to think that shadows are just gray, but in fact, shadows usually contain some light reflected from the surroundings. So if you use gray to make shadows on your yellow flowers, it often looks like a dirty smudge. But a little bit of green or whatever is in the environment around your flowers usually works. When I get around to that second flower, this is where I will only paint my shadow part way up to those petals that overlap on the first flower. And now you can see that the flower on the right is in front of the flower on the left. And now I'll just give each flower a stem. This is another place where I would feel perfectly happy saying, okay, this postcard is done, time to pop it in the mail. But if I have more time, I might decide, well, let's go ahead and add a background and maybe at the same time suggest that interesting raggedy outer edge to the petals. But especially when you're painting on location and you might have just a little bit of time, it's good to ask yourself, do I really need to add more to this? Or does this convey enough of what I wanted to convey as it is? Sometimes we get on autopilot and we don't give our viewers enough credit for being able to absorb what we were trying to communicate without every little detail. But perhaps I really like that yellow and green color scheme, or I want to show that raggedy edge of the petals, so I decide to go ahead and add that green background. A couple of points here. When I designed my painting, I wanted to make sure it would be easy to add this background, so I made my flowers run off the edge of the page. This is not only a more appealing view in many cases because you get in up close and personal with the flowers, but it's also very practical because it means I don't have to keep the same wash going all the way around the flower. I can paint the background in smaller sections, and that allows me to be calmer about painting the background and not feel so rushed. The second tip is that I've mixed the greens for my background from the yellows that I used in the flower, because just as the flower might have some reflected green light, the background may also pick up a little bit of reflected yellow light from the flower. So if I mix my greens using the same yellows, I'll have a more natural look than if I use some unrelated green. As I get down here where the stem is involved, I added a little bit more blue to my green so that my stem would stand out a little bit from the background. As I work my way around painting the background, I'm not being super precise. I'm allowing a little fleck of white to show here or there because I think that makes it a little livelier. And I'm also kind of purposely not being really careful to mix the same green so that there are little subtle variations. In fact, I'd like even a little more variation in the background, so I'm going to try dropping in a little clear water here because I think this is at the point where I could make some intentional blooms that might look like out of focus foliage in the background. And while this is all still wet, maybe I'll drop in a few bits of darker green here and there, again for out of focus shadows in the background. At this point, these flowers look a little bit like cutouts pasted on top of a background, and I'd like to integrate them a bit more into the background. A little trick for that is to use some clear water to selectively soften a few edges here and there. So for example, this petal might go underneath the one above it. So if I wiggle a damp brush along that edge, I'll pick up a little bit of the green and soften the edge at the same time. I also like to soften the edges just as they're going off the page to let things go a little out of focus as we get to the edge of the painting. It's easy to get carried away with this, so pause frequently to make sure that you're not softening every edge everywhere. Look for places where it looks natural that something might be going behind something else, getting a little bit out of focus. Okay, they look a little less like paper cutouts now, but since we've added more detail to the edges and the background, the centers feel a bit vague to me. So this is where I'm going to get my sponge out and add a bit more contrast and texture to those centers. This is very common, by the way, although it would have been fine to stop earlier and just leave the centers as they are with the white background. Now that we've added this green background, the centers of the flowers are no longer the place where we have the most contrast. So we need to make a change so that the whole painting feels like it hangs together. I'm going to use a sponge to add just a little suggestion of a darker textural effect in that center, but I don't want it to go too far out of bounds and get on the petals. So I traced the shape of the center of my flower and I'm cutting it out of a scrap piece of watercolor paper. And now I'll place it down where I want the center of my flower to be, and I'll use my sponge to add just a little bit of a suggestion of texture with a brown that is darker and also a little bit brighter in color. I added a little bit of orange tones to it so that now the center of the flower is once again the area where there's the most contrast and the most color and draws the most attention. And then I do the same to the center of the second flower. And I think I'd like to add just a bit more contrast to the center, so I've mixed up an even darker brown, and I'm going to use my sponge to touch in just a small amount of that for the darker area right in the center of each flower. Once again, I think I could easily call it done here, but since this is a tutorial, I'll show you one more thing that you might decide to do. Maybe we'd like to lift a few stems and leaves out of focus in the background. This is another place where a little scrap of watercolor paper can be handy. I'm using a damp brush to just lift a little bit of the paint, and my little scrap of watercolor paper helps me create a stem that's straight and doesn't get too fat. And I'll just do that here and there in the background. And you can also simply dispense with the little scrap of paper and do this freehand. This actually works even with staining pigments because you really don't have to lift very much color to suggest out of focus green stems in a green background. Another handy little trick is to cut a little leaf shape out of your scrap of watercolor paper and use that as a shield to protect the background and lift just the leaf shape. You want your sponge to be just barely damp, and it usually works best to rock the sponge back and forth or to push the paint towards the center of your open space so that you maintain that edge. And once again, since we're trying to suggest an out-of-focus leaf, you don't need to scrub aggressively or lift a lot of color. As with softening edges, a little bit of this goes a long way, so don't get carried away. I think that's fine, and let's call this one done. I hope you have fun with it. I hope you learned some new tips and tricks that you can take away and use for planning your postcards, and some specific things for backgrounds, flower shadows, and so on. So there you have it, a postcard with 2 cheerful yellow coast sunflowers and several different options for how far to take it depending on the time and materials and energy you have. Have fun, and I'll see you next time. Happy painting.